Hello and welcome to Green Jobs in the Clean Energy Transition, one of Climate Week NYC's flagship events this year. I'm Helen Clarkson, CEO of the Climate Group, and I'll be with you for the next 90 minutes. Thank you all for joining. The transition to a new energy economy is not only essential to halting climate change, but is also a driver of economic growth with the potential to create millions of green jobs. The speed and scale of the energy transition is one of the greatest challenges we face this decade, but it also presents one of the greatest economic and job creation opportunities in history. In the US alone, the new energy economy could create 10 million new jobs directly, and worldwide there'll be over 30 million jobs in the renewable energy sector by the end of this decade. But what will this new energy economy look like? What are green jobs, and how are businesses and governments supporting the transition to a clean energy future that creates opportunities for all? Well, that's what we're here to discuss today. But let's start by talking about what we mean by green jobs. The first ones that spring to mind are, I'm sure, jobs in solar and wind, grid infrastructure and construction. But while those are some of the fastest growing areas in the US labour market, green jobs are not just engineering roles. From data scientists working on smart grids, lawyers and regulators reshaping the rulebooks, to energy auditors and modelers, and workers in recycling plants or working with hazardous waste, there are green jobs right across the economy, and many that we haven't even dreamt of yet. In a new energy economy, new jobs will be created and new skills invented. But as we transition towards this new energy future, it's clear that we need to follow a just and equitable path. If the transition is to be deemed a success, it must create opportunities for everyone. We must put people and communities at its core. We've got a packed agenda for you today, with speakers joining us from across the industry spectrum and across the globe to help us examine the true impact of the clean energy transition. In a minute, we'll hear from US Secretary for Energy, Jennifer Granholm, and we'll close today's event with remarks from Secretary Deborah Haaland, the first Native American appointed as a Cabinet Secretary. So let's get straight into the conversation. I'm joined by Secretary Granholm. She was sworn in as US Secretary for the Department of Energy earlier this year. And already under her leadership, we can see a clear vision for the new energy economy, especially as we build back from the pandemic. The department's commitments to a clean energy future are clear, but as the Secretary has already stated, we must put people, communities and jobs first and ensure we create opportunities for everyone. Secretary Granholm, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be on. Thank you.
And let's start with talking about the jobs and the economic benefits. You know, the infrastructure bill, the American Jobs Plan, they're just two examples of how energy and energy transition can create countless jobs and economic benefits. Where can you see the greatest potential?
Well, so much. First of all, thank you for having me on today. It's really a tremendous honor to be part of Climate Week, New York City. This is obviously, I think, one of the largest gatherings of climate advocates. You all know that this could not come at a more urgent moment, and I'm going to get to the jobs question, but just the urgency for 1 second, because we have lived through a summer. We all have seen it, where nearly 1 in 3 Americans have lived through now a climate disaster. So there's no way we can hit the snooze button on climate action. This is not our alarm clock going off. This is a fire alarm, code red for humanity, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said. So I just want to say that, on behalf of the Biden administration, this is really our moment. We are so committed because of the reasons, obviously the planet, and the reasons you just led in with which is jobs and economic benefits. As the president said, when he hears the words climate change, he thinks jobs. And here's why: because by the end of this decade, the global market for clean energy and carbon reduction technologies is going to reach $23 trillion at a minimum. And so we want to corner that market by building clean energy supply chains and solutions here, sourced in America with American labor. These jobs that we'll create while working to corner that market, we believe will reach every pocket of the country. I mean, just a quick example. Right now, there's a company, Steel of West Virginia, which is working to produce 1,600 tons of steel for a wind turbine vessel that's going to be assembled by Dominion Energy in a Texas shipyard that's going to be used to construct offshore wind farms on the coast of Virginia and New England and New York. And all this took shape after the administration announced our goal of adding 30 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. So building this clean energy economy isn't just about creating jobs directly within these growing industry. It's also going to generate this economic ripples throughout the country. And we want to make sure that Americans of all backgrounds can enjoy those benefits. So, rather than any specific areas within clean energy where we see the greatest potential, which we see a lot, what we at the Department of Energy and the broader administration are focused on is the full scope of clean energy's potential. And it is staggering. And that's why the Build Back Better agenda, that bipartisan infrastructure deal, and the reconciliation bill combined is all about making big, bold investments in clean energy technologies and in our capacity to build them here in America.
It's just so great to hear. And, I've been working on climate a long time, and lots of people have been saying for a long time, there's a huge opportunity agenda here. So it's really just so refreshing to hear, how it's being grasped and seen as this opportunity agenda for the economy, for jobs. But now we get into the kind of nitty-gritty of doing that. And I know that some of what you're doing is working really closely with the labour unions. Can you tell us a bit about that and how they're key to your plans?
Yeah, the president really feels this very deeply, that labor built this country. They built the middle class. And what we've come to learn over the last several decades is that when the labor community is weakened, inequality grows. That's it. I'm so reminded of the great labor leader, Samuel Gompers. And he had this quote, and he asked the question, or he's responding, what does labor want? And everybody thinks, labor just wants more money. And what his quote was, we want more schoolhouses and less jails. We want more books and less arsenals. We want more learning and less vice, more leisure and less greed, more justice and less revenge, more opportunities to cultivate our better nature. So to the extent that any of us has any of these things, really it's thanks to the union movement. And so not only do we owe them a great debt, all Americans stand to gain when we repay it. And the clean energy economy gives us an opportunity to do just that. We're going to need millions of Americans getting to work, building this economy. And it is not just engineers and maintenance workers. It's pipe fitters, it's plasterers, it's painters and plumbers and carpenters and bricklayers and boiler makers and auto workers and iron workers and linemen and journeymen. It is the kind of work that unions can handle better than anybody else. And these jobs should be good paying, family sustaining jobs. And in fact, in many parts of the country, they're already union jobs. So I just quickly earlier this summer, I took a trip to Nevada, and I toured this huge solar facility, town site. I think it's town site near the Hoover Dam. And I met this IBEW foreman named Raquel Dexter, and she makes $50 an hour. And that's what a journeyman earns after a 5-year union-provided apprenticeship. Panel installers make $23.76 and then add full health care and a pension and load it up. These are good paying jobs. And we believe, that clean energy jobs that offer the chance to join a union are going to address that inequality issue. It's going to lift millions of families into the middle class. And that's why we want as many of them to be union jobs. We're committed to baking these strong labor standards into our contracting here at DOE, our contracting and our grant making efforts. We're looking to labor unions themselves for guidance on establishing project labor agreements with targeted hiring goals for women and people of color and LGBTQ. And so, we want to build a skilled workforce that looks like America. And then we're going to do everything in our power to attach those same standards in the new investments that the president is making with this Build Back Better agenda, and to work with union-friendly partners on every clean energy project we possibly can.
Great. And let's talk a bit, because, other parts of the media have presented it as a threat to certain specific jobs. And you've talked about how we create those opportunities for those who might currently be in coal and other fossil fuel-based sectors. Can you talk a bit about how you're going to bring those sectors into the energy transition and the people working in those?
For sure. It's a great question, and it's a really important question. So when I think about, for example, the coal miners in West Virginia, they have powered this country for the past 100 years, and they see their identity in powering the country. We want them to see their identity in powering the country for the next 100 years in clean energies. This is totally personal to me, because when I was governor of Michigan, and I was governor during the recession, the Great Recession, and the auto industry was in bankruptcy, and that we were one industry. We had vast majority of our manufacturing was focused on autos, Motown, et cetera. And we produced a vehicle that relied upon fossil fuels, relies still upon fossil fuels. And when this horrible situation happened with the bankruptcies, we said, you know what, we're not going to abandon our auto industry. We are going to build Car 2.0, which is the electric vehicle, and give people a chance to build that clean transportation sector. And so when President Biden asked me to serve in this role, I accepted on the condition that we would do everything in our power to bring every worker along in this transition. You know, the president knows, I certainly know, how frightening clean energy might seem to fossil energy workers. But it is not a zero sum like that. We fully believe there is a place for them to thrive in this clean energy economy that we want to build. We're actually taking a silver buckshot, not a silver bullet, a silver buckshot approach to clean energy. And what I mean is we're embracing, you know, a wide range of solutions that can help us to reach our goals for emissions reductions and clean energy capacity. So we're deploying market-ready solutions we already have, wind, solar, et cetera. We're innovating our way to the next generation of technologies that we already need. And within that mix is a range of technologies that offer huge opportunities for skills-matched jobs to fossil energy workers. I'm talking about things like hydrogen and green hydrogen, geothermal, carbon capture, sequestration and storage, critical minerals extraction if it's done in a responsible way, and so much more. So we are inviting fossil energy workers to take a seat at the table as we craft those plans for clean technologies. And their input actually has guided the White House. We have an interagency working group on coal and power plant communities. And that group, the interagency, has identified $38 billion in existing federal funding for economic revitalization projects, especially as they relate to clean. And it's a big reason why the Build Back Better agenda includes, about $25 billion to support demonstration projects and research hubs for next generation technologies with that kind of skills matched work potential for those communities. The truth is, it really is the global market that's moving away from fossil energy. But we can help these communities, as we say in Michigan, skate to where the puck is going.
Absolutely. And finally, my last question for you, and final thought. Our theme for this Climate Week NYC is getting it done. What does that phrase mean to you?
Oh, my goodness. It means deploy. Really, it means our hair should be on fire. And we need to deploy we're going to do the research and the development. We've got 17 national labs. We're focused on the future as well. But right now, we have technologies we can deploy off the shelf. We must get thousands of gigawatts of clean energy on our electric grid in the U.S. That means we've got to invest in the grid. We have to invest and incentivize the utilities, the private sector to continue to expand. We had our biggest year last year with respect to installed gigawatts of wind and solar, but we've got to double, triple, quadruple that amount. So we cannot rest. It's all about deployment and getting that clean energy on the grid.
Secretary Granholm, thank you so much for finding time in that amazing agenda you've laid out to speak to us here at Climate Week NYC. And we're just so excited to see what you're going to do over there at the Department of Energy. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks so much.
Bye. Our opening panel today will unpack some of the Secretary's comments. As the Secretary said, the new energy economy will present both challenges and opportunities. As we shift to a cleaner energy mix, the economic and business opportunities are clear, but this comes with a warning that the new energy economy could potentially exacerbate existing inequalities or create new ones. By 2030, new industries like the hydrogen economy and digitising existing energy infrastructure will create entirely new job roles and functions. But as we grapple with the transition while fighting the impacts of climate change, are we ready for the challenge? Are we ready to seize the opportunities presented by the transition? I'd now like to welcome the speakers to join me. So we have Governor Kate Brown, the Governor of Oregon, Mary Burst-Warlick, the Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, Pedro J. Pizarro, Chief Executive Officer of Edison International, and Chris Ashton, Chief Executive Officer at Worley. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
So we clearly need to start planning for net zero today and lay the foundations for the new energy economy. But is this happening at the pace and scale needed? And do you think we can cope with the transition while battling the impacts and effects of climate change on our communities and energy systems? Governor Brown, let's start with you.
We are absolutely not moving rapidly enough. What is really, really clear is that climate change is like a hammer hitting us in the head. In Oregon, in my state, we've had a handful of disastrous climate change events just in the last year, from the heat dome event to historic and unprecedented wildfires to a historic ice storm. Our people are dying, our forests are burning, and frankly, our rivers and lakes are drying up. So the good news is certain states like Oregon have been taking action. We started over 2 decades ago, but it's absolutely imperative that Congress take bold action immediately and that we all work together to make this transition. In my state, we've taken a number of steps in the last handful of years, but it's not enough. We need to move forward at the national level. Very grateful for the Biden administration's leadership.
Thank you. Pedro.
Yes, well, I certainly share Governor Brown's view around the impacts that we're already seeing in California, across the West, and really across the whole country, and the need to take action. So very grateful for the steps going on in Washington. Here in our state of California, the state's been an early and aggressive leader in addressing climate change. We have state law to reduce economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. We have a prior governor's executive order to be carbon neutral by 2045. Our Southern California Edison utility has published a number of analyses showing that the way that the whole economy can get there at 2030 and 2045 is by having dramatic increases in renewable energy and storage, using all that clean energy to electrify other sectors like transportation and buildings, and using low carbon fuels like clean hydrogen for hard to electrify applications, along with some carbon capture. But the scale of this is daunting. And so from the starting point of today, California will have to reduce its emissions by an average of 4.1% each year through 2030, just to get to the 2030 mark. The state so far has reduced emissions by an average of 1% per year since 2005. That's been remarkable given that our GDP has increased 3% per year over the same period, but now we have to quadruple that pace. So we will soon be publishing some updated analysis showing that we're not quite on track. We need to accelerate that with actions over the next year, 18 months, and we need to make sure we do that in a way that helps everybody, keep it affordable, keep it reliable, and bring everyone along, especially our disadvantaged communities.
Thank you. Mary, same question to you.
Thank you very much. And let me just start by saying that the International Energy Agency is very much focused on the challenges of achieving net zero and also very much on the clean energy transition. In fact, we published a global roadmap to net zero by 2050 in May of 2021, just earlier this year. And the roadmap shows that it is technically feasible, though there's a narrow pathway to a 1.5 degree scenario world. But in order to achieve that goal, we need immediate action now to 2030, and in 2 areas in particular. One is rapidly deploying all the currently available technologies today, and 2, to lay the foundations for developing the technologies that are not yet readily available, which will be absolutely critical to address the emissions reductions by 2050. Regarding the pace of the challenge, clean energy transitions really must be for and about people, and this is an area we're very much focused on as well. And this means bringing into the dialogue citizens, workers, and communities to ensure that they support and that the impacts of the transition on them are addressed. In fact, the IEA launched earlier this year the Global Commission for People-Centered Energy Transitions, which is chaired by Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, along with 30 other global leaders, very specifically to address the issues of equity, inclusion, energy affordability, and the impacts of the transition on communities around the world. And I'll just point out that just prior to the COP26, this commission will be issuing a number of recommendations precisely in these areas that we hope will provide important and helpful suggestions to policymakers. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Chris.
Look, I think much has already been said, but I want to emphasize a couple of points around the pace and the scale of the change that's necessary if we're going to hit 2030 and the 2050 goals. And we're talking about the need to invest trillions of dollars in physical assets in the ground. And these are not simple assets. These are not simple projects and investments that need to be made. They are large, they're complex, and they're at scale. But if we're going to do it, we have to convert ambition that we all have, and there's lots of alignment around ambition around the world. We've got to convert it into practical action. We've got to create the environment which is conducive to that investment, and that means policy coming down from government, whether it's at a federal level or a state level, and then it's also got to work from the bottom up. And organizations, our customer base, Worley works with most of the energy resource and chemicals companies. We've got to work with those companies from a bottom-up basis if we're actually going to be able to achieve the goals that are out there. But the scale is unprecedented. The capital deployment necessary for us to achieve what is expected is unprecedented. And if we're going to hit the targets of 2030 and 2050, it has to start now. And the piece of work Worley did with Princeton called Ambition to Reality lays out some of the principles that we're going to have to embrace as a society, as industry, as government, if we're going to, in fact, hit those targets. Pace and scale, complexity are key key in terms of them being recognized if we're going to actually hit the key milestones.
Great, thank you, and agreed with those points. And we covered a lot there. I want to make it real for people and think about what does 2030 look like. So we're talking a lot about, green jobs, future energy jobs. Let's talk a bit about what those jobs look like and how government and business can support those new roles today. Governor Brown, talk to us a bit about that.
I'm sorry, I could not hear your question.
So talking about 2030, what does the new energy economy look like? What are the greatest job creation opportunities? What are future energy jobs? I just want to make it a bit real for people, and then also talk about how government, in particular for you, can help support creating those roles.
Well, I think the harsh reality is that climate change impacts our most vulnerable communities, our communities of color, our low-income communities, and our rural communities. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to center these voices in that policy-making conversation. And that's what we've tried to do here in Oregon over the last several years to ensure that these voices are at the leadership table while we're developing public policy around climate change. So that we don't further exacerbate the impacts of racism on these communities. So, for example, two of the policies that we have moved forward on, one, to make sure that EV infrastructure and vehicles are available for our low-income communities. We created a low and medium-income rebate for families across the state to be able to purchase EV vehicles. We've also just passed legislation to enable our Public Utilities Commission that oversees utility rates to make sure that we can moderate the impacts of the transition on these families. But the other reality is that we know that wind and solar, these new renewable technologies, provide enormous economic opportunity. Since prior to the pandemic, we created over 50,000 jobs in the renewable energy field. And many of these jobs are outside our metropolitan areas, particularly in wind and solar. And these are incredible and amazing opportunities for communities around the state and, frankly, around the country, and a great way to help create this transition in a way that centers our most vulnerable communities.
Great. And yes, I think wind and solar particularly are such fast growing, as you say, areas of jobs. What else, Chris? We've picked off those. What other future energy jobs are there?
So if we look at the technologies that are emerging and are yet to emerge, let's take hydrogen and carbon capture as examples. These are complex process technologies that are going to be deployed, and so it's going to create jobs not just in the building of these facilities, but in the maintenance and the operation of them going forward. So yes, you've got the wind, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, but you've got industrial hubs that will emerge around sort of industrial clusters. And I think the shift that technology will bring and the opportunities that it will provide for people is quite enormous. And I think the rate at which these technologies are becoming economically viable is following similar curves to that which we've seen in wind or solar. And with that, you're going to shift to more distributed energy generation. You're going to see more energy transmission infrastructure needed. And with all of this shift, you're going to see job creation, job opportunities for people, and an environment where, the cost of electricity does not have to be higher to the consumer. And I think these all create opportunities. I think by 2030, we're going to see a lot of traction in this area.
Thank you. And Pedro, sort of to you again, tell us about those jobs, but also what you're doing now to sort of build that workforce for 2030.
Absolutely. I think context here is if you look across the electric utility industry, already today, the investor-owned utilities are collectively deploying capital totaling $140 billion a year last year to provide electricity. And that supplies to 220 million Americans. It supports more than 7 million direct and supplier jobs. That's a starting point, right? If you then look at the investments that will be needed moving forward, just looking at the slice of California, we've estimated that California will need $250 billion in new investment through 2045 for renewables, storage, and bolstering the electric grid, just for that. In addition, there's going to be end-user investments to electrify 3/4 of passenger vehicles, 70% of building space and water heating, and other elements throughout the economy. And the jobs that will create will be accessible jobs and well-paying jobs. So there's a study that the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator put out in 2021 that showed that spending on green investments and sustainable infrastructure creates more jobs per dollar than other infrastructure investments. So it's an exciting opportunity. But then it comes down to how do you do the blocking and tackling at the individual program level? And when Governor Brown talked about the action of the PUC in Oregon, similarly, we're seeing that in other states in areas like transportation electrification. Southern California Edison today has the nation's largest programs around deploying charging infrastructure across utilities. And one of our programs alone is a $400 million program that's going to support the deployment of 38,000 passenger vehicle chargers over the next few years. That is leading to a number of local jobs to support that in local communities. And more than half that investment is targeting low-income, disadvantaged communities, as well as multi-unit dwellings. And so that's just one little example of the kinds of initiatives that will be needed. Number of building blocks across economic sectors that will create jobs. Final point, though, we need to make here is that we need to prepare our workers for that transition and get them the skills needed for these exciting jobs.
Absolutely, and I saw everyone nod at that last point. Mary, I want to come to you. We've obviously got to lead this transition and drive it, but it's only going to be a success if we create opportunities for everyone. Are we doing enough to put people at the heart of the energy transition?
Well, thanks for that question. As I touched on previously, this is an area that the IEA is focusing on very much, and I absolutely agree with our panelists as well that the transition to a new energy economy is going to create significant number of new jobs in all the sectors that they've just identified. The IEA projects that by 2030, in fact, that 14 million new jobs will be created in the energy sector. 5 million will be lost, but that there will be a net gain of 9 million jobs. However, as was just touched upon, there is a good deal that needs to be done to focus on the communities that will lose and the impacts on them, as well as on the job reskilling and retraining for those workers. So our view is that it's really very important that comprehensive plans be developed early on, both by governments and by the private sector, to look at working through those reskilling and retraining challenges in local communities. And there have been some sectors where such focused attention has already taken place, in the coal sector in particular, in the EU, in the US, and in China. But we think increasingly as the transition progresses that it'll be important to be looking at other sectors and industries as well that are impacted. In fact, our projections show that by 2030, 30 million workers will need additional skills in the energy sector, and 60% of them requiring a high level of training. So once again, really very important to be planning ahead. There are some excellent examples out there of countries who have taken the time as well to focus on building out support for the transition among all stakeholders. Denmark, for example, back in the 1970s, as they looked from transitioning from coal to wind, really had a successful result in working with communities and government and all stakeholders to build support for that transition. And Spain is another example of a government that worked closely with trade unions to ensure that the needs of workers were addressed as the transition out of coal to wind took place. So there are good examples, but I guess the bottom line, the key message I would want to convey on this is the importance of really beginning to make plans now for the transition and the impacts of the transition that lie ahead.
Thank you. And maybe Governor Brown, you could come in on this question as well. And you've mentioned it in your last answer, but tell us more about how you're putting people at the centre of this.
That's a really good question. I think it's really about bringing resources and training to where people are at, to the communities around, at least for us, our state. And just let me share two really specific examples. Lynn Benton Community College, Mid-Willamette Valley, they have an amazing auto program that are training students, many of whom are first-gen students in EV technology in our automobiles and other alternative fuels, including CNG. At the Columbia Gorge Community College in the Hood River area, we are training students on wind turbine technology, which is obviously where a lot of our wind energy is. So really great examples of taking the training and giving communities the expertise in the areas where it's absolutely happening. So those are two concrete examples.
Great, thank you. And let's just turn a bit to the consumers. Obviously, in recent months, energy prices have gone up. Fears that the energy transition is going to hit consumers hard. I know the media likes to jump on anything like that and the stories around that. Is the new energy economy going to be affordable? How do we ensure that it doesn't impact the most vulnerable and poorer communities? Pedro, maybe I could put that question to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really important one. And let me start with where we see this going to 2045, using the California example. We do believe that as consumers use more electricity to decarbonize end-use applications like transportation and buildings, and as we need to make the investments needed in the grid to support that, that may put pressure on electric prices and certainly on electric bills. However, our analysis showed that our average consumer will actually be spending around a third less across their total energy bill. So add up electricity and gasoline and natural gas. That combined bill will go down by a third through 2045 because of the greater efficiency of electric technologies. So that's a fantastic, outcome that says that we can not only decarbonize, but we can bring down overall costs for everyone. However, it's really important that everybody be part of the transition. And so we cannot leave our disadvantaged communities behind. There's a cost upfront that needs to be made in retooling appliances, retooling, changing your vehicle out. The next time that your stove breaks, putting in an induction stove or an electric water heater. And that can have a cost increment initially in order to get the benefits of a long run. That's why it's so important that programs remember that and bring our disadvantaged communities along, provide the appropriate kinds of incentives and subsidies to make sure that this transition is equitable for everybody. Because we can see that in the long run, it's affordable. An electric vehicle today, on a total cost of, a total lifetime cost basis, is actually more economic than a traditional gasoline vehicle. However, that upfront cost is hard for a disadvantaged customer to pick up. And by the way, a third of our residential customers are qualified for low-income assistance. So we need to make sure that we bring all of our communities along. Final thought is that this is not just about decarbonization. It's not just about economics. But it's also about other attributes like air quality. And the reality is that our disadvantaged communities today carry much more than their share of the burden of climate change, and that will continue to happen in the future. And so making sure that this transition is accessible to them is just critical. So whether it's working through utilities, whether it's working through the actions of other industrial players, we see our Edison Energy subsidiary helping a number of large commercial and industrial customers in their own transitions. We need to work this across the entire economy and do it in a way that's affordable, reliable, but inclusive of everyone.
Thank you. And Chris, the same question to you.
Yeah, look, I think if we get this right, the cost of energy shouldn't increase. But part of getting it right is starting now, is really accelerating the work that's been done by many states, but really accelerating. Now, there's a lot of scaremongering out there at the moment, and we need to counter that with the facts. If you look at Princeton's analysis in its Net Zero America study, it showed that achieving net zero is affordable. Its study identified that the pathways need to increase the expenditure on energy as a percentage of GDP. And I think there's a lot of myth out there that we need to continue to counter and through education and discussion and debate. And look, the fact is not all of the net zero pathways are more capital intensive than the ones that we've currently seen. But I think crucially, the cost of inaction is becoming clearer. The cost of inaction is becoming more and more apparent and less acceptable. What's been happening on the West Coast in Oregon, what's been happening just 2 weeks ago with Hurricane Ida going through Louisiana. We had a large number of our staff impacted directly. These weather events are absolutely catastrophic and have a devastating impact. And without the change that we're talking about, without embracing action that is necessary to achieve the climate change targets, the cost of inaction is going to be much greater. And the financial markets and insurers begin to understand the risk and are pricing it into their products. And that's what I'm observing is massive capital flows around low carbon projects and businesses right now. But the bottom line is if we start now, if we get it right, energy doesn't need to be more expensive.
Thank you. And just my last question, and I'll ask this to all of you. What can you do, or what are you doing to make sure that the transition doesn't leave anyone behind? And we'll go in the reverse from my opening question. So, Chris, maybe you could start with that.
Certainly, we have 50,000 people around the world. We're focusing on the projects that we're doing, bringing our communities along, the social impact, and we're retraining people. The fact that we can take a skilled workforce, many of the skills can point toward the future needs, but we can reskill, but also bringing people, emphasizing the importance of non-degreed degree opportunities, the amount of skilled labor we're going to need to affect this transition successfully is massive. So putting in place training programs, apprenticeships, and bringing communities along. This is going to be a very different energy infrastructure in the future to that which we see today. Distributed, more rural power generation, putting opportunities into the rural communities, and with that, job opportunities and opportunity for economic progression.
Thank you. Mary.
Thank you. We absolutely agree that making the transition work for all people is really vital and incredibly important going forward. It's important, I think, to recognize that the transition will span decades. And for that reason, as I've mentioned, we also think it's vital that we start now to developing the long-term plans to get to where we need to be to achieve the net zero goals, our net zero goals by 2050. It also means, as I mentioned, starting now with developing long-term plans and engaging in a real social dialogue with all stakeholders to ensure that there's a very inclusive approach to the transition that will have broad public support. And it will require concerted effort by government, private sector, civil society, and others to really focus on the areas of retraining, as I've mentioned, reskilling, and really significantly investing in communities that will be impacted. And once again, I'd just like to reference again the Global Commission work that's being done to focus very specifically on these issues of equity, inclusion, and affordability. And very much looking forward, and I hope you will take a look too at our recommendations that come out at the end of October before the COP. Thank you.
Thank you. We will indeed be ready for that report. Pedro.
Well, let me just first say thank you for bringing us together for this great discussion. Two big areas. One, our company is engaged in the global and national discussion, and one of our big messages there is that this really needs to be a transition that's economy-wide. We need to optimize across all sectors of the economy, not just energy, because there's contributions to be made to decarbonize our society, writ large. The second level, though, is local action. Right. So whether that is the kinds of programs that our utility is pursuing around transportation electrification and building electrification I mentioned earlier, making sure that those have a tilt in them towards supporting those who need it most to make sure that the transition is fair, just, equitable, and not leaving the disadvantaged behind. And then importantly, other small local steps like things that we're doing, just as Chris, in building our workforce. Just launched, for example, a scholarship to help increase the number of diverse line workers that we have, in our community. Those sorts of small local actions are important steps to make sure that we have a transition that includes everyone, that has the right workforce trained, and that workforce reflects the wonderful diversity of our communities.
Thank you. And finally, Governor Brown.
Thank you. And it's just been an honor to talk with all of these panelists. Number one, centering the voices of our communities of color, our low-income communities and our rural communities as we make this transition, that our training systems need to have a bottom-up, not a top-down approach that creates a seamless system of education to enable our students and young people to be ready to compete in the global economy. We cannot do this without strong support from our private sector partners. Companies in Oregon like Nike have been intentionally reducing their carbon footprint. Intel working with PGE to move to 100% clean. The policies that Oregon is moving forward on would not happen without these private sector partners. And the utilities are leading this work because they know that it is both cost effective and the right thing to do. And then lastly, this does not happen without support from our federal government, from Congress taking bold action and the Biden administration's leadership. The federal highway system did not get built it would not have been built without support from the federal government. Same is true with electrifying the entire country. We will not be able to move to EV infrastructures systems throughout the West that are reliable and address range anxiety without the investments that the Biden administration is planning to make in EV infrastructure. So we absolutely need the support of our federal government.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for a really great discussion today. Thank you very much for joining us. Next, we're joined by Megan Darby, editor of Climate Home News. Megan continues the conversation on justice and equity in the energy transition with Damilola Ogunbayi, CEO and Special Representative of the UN Secretary-General for Sustainable Energy for All and co-chair of UN Energy. They sat down ahead of the UN High-Level Dialogue on Energy, the first meeting of its kind in over 30 years.
Thanks, Helen. I'm Megan Darby, the editor of Climate Home News, and I'm delighted to be here with Damilola Ogunbayi, the Special Representative to the UN on Sustainable Energy. Hi, Damilola, how are you doing?
Hi, Megan. How are you doing? And thank you for having me today.
So, Damilola, you have done a lot of work in your career on sustainable energy. What does it mean when we talk about sustainable energy access? When you go somewhere where they've just got access to modern, sustainable, reliable energy, what does it mean to those people and what does it look like?
I think firstly, when we talk about climate and this issue of energy transition and the energy transition story, we have to realize fundamentally it also has to be an energy access story. We've got billions of people who can't do what we're doing right now. They don't have access to safe, clean electricity. And, we have maybe a third of the world's population that have no access to clean fuels. So it's energy to do stuff. It's energy to develop. It's energy to live a dignified life. It's energy for healthcare. That's what we really mean by sustainable energy, not the minimum amounts of energy, but energy that you can actually develop and develop out of poverty. And that's why maybe sometimes you heard the term energy poverty. So it doesn't necessarily mean you don't have any energy at all. It just means that the energy you have is not enough to do what you really need to do to strive. And I think what is most important, and again, the links with climate, is that we will not be able to hit our all common goals for net zero by 2050 if we do not provide safe, clean and affordable access to electrification and clean cooking solutions to everyone on the planet by 2030.
And I'm looking, so that's the goal, universal clean energy access by 2030. I'm looking at your latest annual report and the headline figures. So at the last count, and this is 2019 data, I think, so pre-pandemic, there was 759 million people with no access to electricity. There were 2.6 billion people with no access to clean cooking. So they're cooking food on dirty stoves. And 17.1% of final energy use came from renewables. So there was progress on all measures from 2010, but not nearly enough to get on that path to 2030. What needs to happen now to expand that energy access and to really deliver those energy services to people who need them?
I think the first thing that needs to happen is people understanding energy is a pathway to our climate promises. The second thing is obviously finance, right? It's a huge amount of money that we need for climate, and it's about 40 billion a year that we need to extend and really, really eradicate energy poverty. And we know the money's out there because, with the COVID relief, I think the global north spent like 17 trillion of less than 1% money on COVID relief. So the money to make sure 1 billion people get out of poverty is also really important. Apart from the money, there needs to be the policy frameworks in place in a lot of countries. And there also needs to be, the willingness and the drive of all countries to come together and solve this very, very critical issue, which is the difference between life and death for many people around the world.
And how big a setback has there been from the pandemic to all these efforts? Do you see it as diverting that money, or is there an opportunity to get some of that like post-pandemic stimulus into this serving this agenda?
Well, we always wish to get the post-pandemic stimulus into this agenda, into a clean, sustainable agenda, because we know that's the fastest way out of economic growth. But there has been setbacks. There's at least 150 million people that have gone back to extreme poverty, most of them in Africa, and most of them are people who might have had some electricity that has gone back. So, even the figures we look to, we're going to probably have more people, unfortunately, after this pandemic with no access to electricity at all. It's also added to what I would like to call, and many people speak about the inequalities in terms of the vaccines, right? So there are not enough vaccines going to developing countries as it is, but even some of the vaccines going in are being wasted because there's not the electricity to be able to store some of these vaccines. So these are really, really key issues. And if something COVID has taught us is that we are all in this together, you can't just have, part of the world being vaccinated and the rest of the world. It's the same thing with climate. So if you leave 1 billion people without access to energy, you can't achieve your climate targets as well.
And you're co-chairing a high-level dialogue on Friday on energy at the UN General Assembly with leaders. What do you want to see from leaders at that summit? What would success look like? What would good outcomes look like from that summit?
Well, success will look like putting these pledges into actions. And what I mean by that is we've come up with something called the UN Energy Compact. And although we have many compacts, this is one of the first compacts that you actually have to say in terms of sovereigns, private sector, cities, exactly which actions you're going to take in order to achieve the targets of SDG 7 by 2030, either in your own country or how you're going to support other countries. And we feel like this is the game changer that we need. We've got 9 years to go. We have to be able to track this progress. And we really have to look to exactly how are we going to solve these problems. It's the first time in 40 years the UN has actually called a meeting on energy, which just shows you how energy has been pushed aside a little bit, but energy has to be at the forefront because it affects so many people, and it also has a direct link on at least 50% of the emissions that we speak about, going into the atmosphere in terms of climate as well. So we're looking at all countries coming together and a full global effort because it's for all our common goals.
Your role is promoting sustainable energy for all. How much of a tension do you see between the sustainable part of that and the for all part of it? Are there some areas where it's really hard to achieve energy access without it being based on fossil fuels? And what do you see as the solutions to that?
I think a lot of noise has been made in terms of you can't have development and climate targets working hand in hand. And I think that is absolutely unfair. I think just like global north countries, there is the whole point of the name energy transition is transitioning out of something. But I want to put this in context. For sub-Saharan Africa, which is where I'm from, there's 81 gigawatts installed capacity for 1 billion people. It's pretty much the same thing as Germany produces. So the conversation has to be had that for Africa to get out of poverty, more energy has to be in place than less energy. And they have to transition out of dirty fuels. What fuels you use to transition out of things and the stop dates is what we should be talking about instead of do we have this fuel or do we have that fuel? It has to really look at people and planet. And I think that's been the problem. We've looked at planet on one side and people on the other side. And what we're trying to say is that, look, it has to come together, because if it doesn't come together, there's no point, focusing on a continent that's responsible. Well, if you take away South Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is responsible for 0.55% of emissions. What are we decarbonizing there? We have to be able to come together as a global north and say it's going to take up this carbon to get people out of poverty. But what is the clean energy offer to make sure that conversation is a renewable conversation, which is what we're doing, what we're insisting, and trying to get everybody to rally behind us, because it is going to take a long time. It's taken, a lot of the most sophisticated, the developed world are still going through it, and they're not going to get there till 2050. So Africa's not the one that's going to leapfrog across with the least amount of money. And that's very, very important for people to know. We need to have money on the table and the policies and the the political will to make sure getting out of poverty and achieving our climate goals go hand in hand for one of the largest continents in the world.
Okay, money on the table. That's a clear takeaway from this session. Thank you, Damolola, and back to you, Helen.
And for our final panel, we're joined by Halla Thomasdottir, CEO of the B Team. Halla, this panel you're going to host is on the clean, just and equitable transition. You've got 4 speakers joining you from different sectors. What do you want to hear from them?
Well, thank you, Helen, for having us and having this most important topic at the end of this important day. I am hoping that we will have a robust, multi-stakeholder approach to the most important question we're all facing. How will we go from our current reality, where humanity is suffering on many fronts, and so is our only home, the planet, to the future, where we have shared prosperity on a healthy planet? And we will hear that from multiple stakeholders, and I'm so looking forward.
Great. And at B Team, you've been doing a lot on this yourself. Looking forward to hearing about that and hearing from the panel.
Thank you, Helen. Let's dive right in and welcome everyone to this important conversation about a green, clean, just and inclusive transition to the future that we as humanity not only want, but need. I'm from Iceland, so I often feel like it's in my DNA to think about sustainability and equality at the same time. But I now live in New York, and the impacts of climate and impacts on people are as real in Iceland as they are in my new home in New York, more recently with the weather events that many of us experienced. We have worked with the Just Transition Center to develop Just Transition business guidance that contains some advice as to how to do this. And we also worked on the Just Transition and Decent Jobs pledge, where some of the leading energy companies like Enel, Iberdrola, and Engie are all part of. So this is something we have cared deeply about for a long time. But one of the things we have learned on this journey at the B Team is we cannot get from the current reality to the future with only one stakeholder lens on. We have to bring people together. So I couldn't be happier that we now have actually represented here science, business, government, and labor all coming together in this important conversation. I hope we can all bring our listeners into the reality from each stakeholder lens, but ultimately see at the end of this conversation why this transition is all of ours to lead. So let's get the conversation going. And if I may go to you first, Sophie, you became president and CEO of Hydro-Quebec in 2020 at a very difficult time in this world. Why do you care about a clean and just transition, and why should our audience care about it?
Well, good day to you. Good day to you all. I would say, being an energy executive, I know for a fact that for decades, when companies and major decisions makers, politicians, regulators have thought about the energy system, they would think about assets, productions, transmission, distribution. For too long, and now we suffer from it, we have not thought enough about the human being at the end of what we call the food chain. And the human being is certainly the most important stakeholder of everybody. There is somebody that is striving for clean, renewable, reliable, and competitive electricity today. So we need to take care of the human being and reverse the way we think, not from the production to the customer, but from the human being, and then build up whatever is needed to get there, cheap, reliable, and competitive.
Thank you, Sophie. James, may I go to you? You're the president of the National Utility Workers in America. Please give us the perspective of labor.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Alla, and thank you for having me here and everybody in this vital conversation. But truth be told, it has to be a conversation that's no longer starting to be a conversation, but an action plan, and something that has fruitful sides of it. Truth be told, on labor sides is that we know that there's no good jobs on a dead planet. If we keep destroying this planet, there's going to be no places for our members to work. And we're seeing the impacts of it, not just in my industry, but just even in what we do every day in and day out, from collective bargaining to what we see in our health programs that we have. We know the impacts are long and are going to be issues that are going to be constantly on labor's table. But we have to look at the full transition. When we use the words just transition, we have to look at a complete transition. That is the industry, the workers, and the community. They all have to move together. If we don't have everything in the same platform, it's not going to come out to fruition. And we have to be able to have those conversations and really be honest and open with each other in order to accomplish this clean energy and a cleaner environment.
Thank you, James. Annie, if I may go to you next. You represent, you're president and CEO of WRI and in some way represent the voice of science here. Why do you care? Why should people care? Because science hasn't quite been moving us at the speed and scale that we'd like yet, has it?
No, the science has been clear for a long time, Hala. Thank you for having me here. The climate change is here, right? You can see it every day in the newspaper, what's happening across the world. We used to think climate incident happened, far away. It's happening everywhere. The recent report from Science As You Speak actually paints a very clear picture. So I don't think science needs to do more. It's an action that we just heard about from two other speakers that needs to happen. What I'm very glad, we all know that we need to reduce our emission by 50% to have a chance in the next 9 years. That's the deal. That's what we need to do. And I'm very glad you asked the questions to be not only clean, but just transition. Because it needs to be really first, it's not a decarbonization plan, but a transition plan from an economy that we have today that's high carbon unequal to economy we need tomorrow that's equal and low carbon and good for nature and good for people. For that to happen, we need to take this whole system approach. Exactly your question. I mean, in India alone, there were 700,000 jobs in coal. We have to figure out a way what happens to them. It's 6 million global. So for us to have a plan forward, it has to be a just transition plan. And I feel it's not just, funness is morally right? We need to make sure everyone benefits, but it's a political imperative. We won't be able to do good climate policy if people don't accept it. So I feel there is no other way to actually have a transition plan and to have a just transition plan.
Couldn't have said it better. Thank you, Annie. And that is a perfect segue to come to you, Basil, Commissioner of Department of Environmental Protection in New York State. We know we're in this moment of political division and division across many other lines, and we've had headwinds on this agenda. But why do you care, and why should our listeners care that we put people first as we develop this transition into the future that is green and clean and just?
Why should we put people first? I mean, that is the question. And we have made so many mistakes over the last 100 years plus, that has brought us to this point right now. Short-term thinking that has pervaded government at every level. And we have this amazing opportunity right now to take what I believe is this rare set of circumstances where you have science, you've got industry, you have labor, you have the people who not only believe that the science is accurate on this right now, but are seeing every day that there is the need to take action on this. So why do I care? I mean, I care as a father and as just a human being seeing the devastation being wrought around the world. But in crafting this political solution for climate change, we in New York, we like to think we're first at everything and the biggest and the best at everything. You're probably seeing that now, Hala, being in New York. But we have an incredible obligation right now within the state's climate law, which is often thought of as one of the most aggressive in the country, if not the world, to hit very ambitious targets. Those targets are big and bold, and if we get there, we'll have a brand new economy. But the way that the law was crafted actually brings the transition into the construction of those targets and how we reach those targets, how we transition all these jobs, how we ensure that there are only winners, there are no losers in this, and that's by bringing everyone to the table. And it's been really, since we signed the law 2 years ago, an incredible amount of work after that first euphoria of signing this bill, an incredible amount of work that's gone into just setting the table for success. And You only get there when you have every single person invested in this at the table and have a long-term plan to communicate those pathways. So I'm very optimistic that we'll get there. I think all the pieces are in place, but the work ahead of us is going to be enormous.
Thank you, Basil. And that brings me back to you, Sophie. I really want to try to get the discussion going here for all of you to bring the multiple perspectives here. And I'm wondering if you could put on the energy sector hat more broadly and tell us, what does a just transition look like? What are the tangible actions that we should be taking in order to lead this transition more inclusively, more justly?
Well, I echo everything that has been said by my fellow panelists, and what James said about, you know, the worker. We need to take care of the worker. I think the biggest intellectual challenge that we have is to raise the chopper from the companies, from the government, from the unions. And I go back to what you were saying, James. It's just raise the chopper and look at an optimal solution for everybody. So if we oppose wind to solar to hydroelectricity, if we say not Canada, only US, if we say no union, cheapest labor possible, I mean, we're all going to go the wrong way. We are called upon the common good. And the common good requires us to think very differently, because a company looks at its bottom line, a government looks at the local impact, but and so on. But if we raise the chopper and we say, what is the optimal solution that we can get clean, reliable, competitive electricity, that we transit the unions through what we have to do and make sure that not only the unions, every worker needs to transit into this new reality. How do we responsibilize ourselves to get there? And from the government perspective, saying, yes, there are local impacts, but at the end of the day, there is a human being that will be paying an electricity bill. And people have other things to do, frankly, than to pay an electricity bill. They have other things to do with their money. So if we balance all that, let me give you a very specific example. When we look at the need in New York and the need in New York City more specifically, we see that there is no silver bullet. There is no single solution that will resolve everything. Local, renewable, cheap, shovel-ready, now, today, cheap. It does not exist. We need an all-hands approach. It's not wind against electricity against solar. It's all this is complementary. And we both need to work between US and Canada. And some people, for example, would say, not from Canada. Well, actually, Canada is supplying 5% of New York's power today with reliable, cheap, renewable energy already. So the point is, do you want more? And we believe humbly that it's a good thing for New York. It's a good thing for us. It's a good thing for everybody, because New York will want to develop its own renewable energy base, and that's fine, just like you've done upstate New York. Upstate New York, now you have lots of renewables. The issue and the task is in the south of the state. So as time goes by, New York will build more wind, more solar, but you will need to balance it. And if you don't have a balance, it will be extraordinarily costly and not reliable. So the point is it when local against Canadian? No, it's an all-hands approach. And if we work all together, and actually the Duke's University provided a study on that, MIT provided a study on that, if we look at it as an overall system where energy flows, if we build transmission, giving work to good union workers, construction site, as we build a transmission line, if we are sensitive, and if a company like mine and others is not looking at the last penny in its pocket, and we certainly won't do that, then we can achieve it.
I love that optimism and that call for us to take a whole system and a win-win approach. Thank you, Sophie. James, it feels like I should come to you next. Our movement for climate action has most certainly left many people behind, the way we've talked, and made a lot of people feel at least like they will be left behind. Tell us about the actions we need to do to give people dignity and pathways, including upskilling, to come along and on this transition in the most positive way for them and the system and the transition as a whole.
You know, Hala, you're 100% correct on we've left a lot of workers behind. We've seen industry from our coal mining to our auto industry of plant closures and communities being devastated. Those are economic growths that a lot of our members have done for decades and have built families and sustainable communities and built economic growth in a lot of areas in this country. It's not just a one single answer on this whole thing. It's a big approach of it. And we have to look completely at the picture of it. We got to make sure that we look at the current workforce, our future workforces, and actually those who are experienced. I've always used the term of veterans of energy in my membership because truthfully, they've done a lot of work for our service, for our economy, and for our country. We would not have had growth in a lot of areas if it wasn't for the utility workers doing their works day in and day out. And then especially on the dire need, we see them rushing out to respond to major storms out there. We see them battling wildfires in California. Right? So we need to make sure that we have a growth in our industry, in our workforces, make sure we have sustainable workforces, not a transient workforce, but a workforce that's going to be able to cover what's got to be done. We also need investment. We need to make sure that we put money where it is needed. We have a failing infrastructure. We got to make sure that not only on our generation side, it's moving into a new progress, but our current infrastructure has to be available and ready for that. Right now, we're not doing that. We're having a lot of conversations. We need our elected officials to move on a lot of things of that. We need our communities to work with us on that. We need to make sure there's growth in it. We need to make sure that the worker is ready for the next part of it. Utility workers have always been transient in a lot of areas. We've gone from plants that were coal at one time to natural gas. It doesn't happen overnight, but it takes us to be included in the process to make sure that we're included in making sure what battery storage looks like to wind and solar. We need to make sure that we're actually taking care of those who can't fit into these equations. We know that the industry is not going to be able to support what we had in a power plant on a wind farm. We understand that, but we got to make sure that the displaced worker is not left on the curb. If that displaced worker is left on the curb, we're going to get resistance. These are men and women that have put their life forward to making sure that we're able to move into this new energy. We can't forget them.
Well said, James. And I think this feeling of leaving behind has actually been creating headwinds instead of tailwinds for our movement. And until we get that right, we're not going to move at the speed and scale that's needed. Annie, this brings me back to what we mentioned earlier. Science is clear. It's been clear for a long time. Yet we are really struggling with moving humans into actions at the speed and scale we need. What's needed to translate the science so that, and sort of connect the science and the everyday reality now to understand this long-term journey that we need to go together on with all stakeholders? What's missing to unlock that transformative leadership we need?
I think science has been clear and couldn't be clearer. Actually, the last report for IPCC couldn't be more stark, right? I just want to build on what Sophie and James said. I think what we need is a new kind of leadership. So the science is clear, right? We need to decarbonize the world, right? And we need to make half of our emission by next 9 years. But the journey to that outcome is exactly what Sophie was saying, is a whole system journey. It's not about just decarb. We need a different economy where we bring everyone together to that new economy, how this will work, how everyone will benefit from it. And I just want to add two things that James's article is the jobs question. It's not just about jobs, it's about people in our society, how that will transition. So I think our leader's job is to paint the picture what this outcome in the future is actually good. It's going to be cleaner air for us. It is going to be good energy for us. Our kids will go to school in electric bus and will not have diesel fuel. That is the outcome but the journey is actually bringing a whole system approach. I just want to say two things. The transition is not just about decarbonization and jobs, it's also about extension. There are 800 million people in the world who actually don't have energy enough. They need to get energy. We need to figure out how do they get it while decarbonizing at the same time. So it is not just a question of we are consuming too much, or it's just, we need to be thinking about, even in the United States, for example, we want to make sure our rural communities don't have to pay too much for the energy transition. In the bill right now in Congress, there is funds right now to pay utilities so that it is equitable, the transition is equitable. If you have electric cars, we want to make sure charging facilities are equitably available. So I do think a people-centric approach to the transition and going away for this language of decarbonization, but the transition is the way to do it, because the science is one thing, but moving society from where we are to a society we need, it's really a political transition, right? Isn't it? It is to bring all of us together. And our leaders' job is to bring us together towards a journey that only can happen if every sector, I repeat, every sector, every level, cities, businesses, countries, work together to get there.
So well, thank you. Well put, Annie. And that really is, again, the perfect segue to Basil. We're in a moment of deep divisions on everything from climate to COVID, and yet we're facing that we have to do this transition. The weather events are already in our backyards. How do governments step up even more, become 10 times bolder in bringing people together to own this transition across stakeholders, across political divides, across America and across the world?
Ani, thank you for the setup on that one. We're at war over facts right now. I mean, it's crazy to say that. We're at war over facts and science. How many months have we been doing COVID? And now we're back at it again about masks and vaccines. I mean, it seems crazy. Look at what happened in Europe this summer. What happened in Manhattan and in the 5 boroughs underwater. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've traveled to disaster areas just in New York State over severe weather, and it's getting worse. I mean, I completely agree the science is nailed on this. So you take the science, you take the facts that are in front of you, and how do you create success long-term out of this? That is one hell of a task, because the way we've tried to do it has not worked, right? To Ani's point, hitting decarbonization. It has to be about a vision. It's got to be about jobs. And it has to be about communication pathways that get us beyond this 4-year cycle where whomever is in Washington gets to control the narrative for the next 4 years. You look back at what FDR went through at when he took office, with the Great Depression at hand, the massive economic fallout, and his vision, which crystallized into the New Deal. And what he set into motion, whether it was preordained or not, was basically a 70-year communications plan, where the implementation of the New Deal with new government structures, new policies, new programs was matched up with a communications plan that could convince Americans to come along for the ride and to buy into a larger vision. That is absolutely what is needed here. I say 70 years, by the way, because there are still New Deal programs that are going alive and well here in the U.S. So yes, something is needed to get past that political hurdle, the war over facts, talk about the jobs, make sure everyone is touched, make sure everyone is considered as part of the solution. You're transitioning those jobs into the jobs of the future. The technologies, most of them exist. So you're talking about making those connections and then making it comfortable for politicians to then take chances within their election cycles to say yes to certain investments on things. Do the ribbon cuttings, get the states on board, get the counties on board, get the towns on board. Ultimately, that gives a cover for the federal government to sustain these things over time. I think we're there. I think we will be there if this keeps going the direction it will.
You're building the perfect bridge into sort of the final round of thoughts I wanted to elicit from you. I wish we had more time. This is such an important topic, but we are at a time where a lot of people are losing hope. We've sort of been bombarded by fear over quite many things, and that does seem to be paralyzing rather than unlocking the transformational leadership we need in the full system, as you've all stated. I wanted you to please share with our audience, and maybe I can now start with you, Basil, and go in the reverse order. What gives you stubborn optimism that we are actually going to move from this current reality that feels stark to, I think, all of us, to this future of shared prosperity on a healthy planet?
Well, listen, you can't take a government job unless you're a stubborn optimist. I mean, I am a stubborn optimist, always have been. And, I draw strength from the successes of the past, where we've had incredible challenges, and we rise to meet those challenges. COVID is a perfect example. I mean, we as an agency here, we're not a health agency per se, but we got hit in New York in a particularly hard way. 1,000 of my 3,000 staff stepped up, and we started building, vaccination sites and testing sites and drive-through meal centers, and the ability of people to come together and solve problems is extraordinary. And you look all over the world where that happens, where crisis sets in and people find a way to band together and get beyond their petty differences. That is human nature. We've gotten somewhat more complacent in recent times, thinking that perhaps the issues, the sky is falling and nothing can be resolved. In human history, we come together when we need to, and we solve these problems. And again, it goes back to communication, showing people the way, engaging them, not setting them off to the side, but engaging them in the solution, bringing them together to help craft those permanent plans. I have to be stubbornly optimistic that when all the science and the technology and the workers are all on the same page, there's an opportunity for us to have an amazing future. And I'm ready for hopefully another 50 years of action on the government side on my part. Who knows?
Thank you, Basil. I would even go further than complacency and say we've suffered a crisis of conformity when it comes to climate and inequality in the world. And it feels like maybe the last year and a half is kicking us out of that complacency. And I hope this will go down in history as our great awakening for sure. But Annie, what's keeping you stubbornly optimistic at this moment?
I'm in Basil's camp. I think it's very difficult for us to have these jobs if we were not stubbornly optimistic. At the same time, Hala, this has been a bleak year, to be honest. If you look around, not only the pandemic, how unequal the impact of the pandemic was to poor people across the world, all the weather events going on, Afghanistan, it's full of not so good news. At the same time, I'm optimistic where there are four things happening that's not in the news. And that is a revolution that is taking place that makes me feel something is afoot. And the four things are following. Three of the biggest economies of the world, United States, China, EU, have committed climate action that even 2 years back, year and a half back, you wouldn't have imagined that this was possible to do. And 62 countries in next month in Glasgow will commit to a much higher ambition than they already have committed to much higher. So that's one. There is a shift taking place. No one, except few I could count, no one is saying climate is not real. They all are trying to figure out what and how much they can do. Number two, companies across the world, 1,700 of the so far and more coming, has actually signed up to science-based targets for decarbonizing their companies. This is actually, again, 2 years back, this number was less than 300. So there is something going on. In the global capital, there's about $110 trillion of global, pension funds and things like that, life insurance. People have committed $70 trillion to pledge towards green investment. $14 trillion actually already been moved to green investment. And finally, cities. Hundreds of cities across the world committed to very high ambition, much higher than their own countries. If you just think about this for a minute, this is just a revolution that is happening. And it's just, you can't see it right now because it's so dark right now. It's just the darkness before dawn. I don't want to pretend that's going to be easy going forward. I think the path to a just transition is a narrow path. And our job is to be clever and smart to provide the right solutions to our leaders so that we make the right choices to get the jobs, to decarbonize the world, to make nature positive and make it good for people. But I'm optimistic the path is there. There are enough solutions in the world. We just have to figure out how we all come together and scale them.
Thank you for those real concrete examples that we don't see enough of in the news. So thank you, Annie. James, how about you? What keeps you stubbornly optimistic?
Well, I'm always going to be optimistic. Like I started off today, there is no good jobs on a dead planet. And if we don't really put our work and start acting on our needs and our wants in all campgrounds, we're not going to have a planet to sit down on. right? And that's the truth be told. You know, I'm a believer of we should always leave the next generation better than the generation before. Right now, we're failing on climate. We're failing miserably. When people are dying in basements in New York City or homes are destroyed in California from fires, there is something vitally wrong. And workers are really suffering today in it. And we want to make sure in labor that we have our voices on it. When we're driving hours to workplaces and not able to go home because we're actually traveling out of state to recover from storms, we want to make sure our voices are heard. We want to make sure that the workplace is stable for us. If it's repowering a plant or putting clean technology on that plant, or making sure when the transition's in it that we're not left back behind like a community before. We want to make sure that we can at least provide for our families, provide for our workplaces, and provide economics for our communities. You know, I truly believe as a person, and any human should always believe that they make a difference in their own life, in their families' lives, and in their communities. And if we are not stubborn on it, we've given up. And I'm going to tell you, in the voice of labor, we never give up. We're always going to be in the fight and always to be heard.
I welcome that, James. And I think you're just mentioning what almost ought to be human rights, that we all have the ability to take care of our loved ones, ourselves, and our communities around us. Sophie, I'll give you the opportunity to bring this home for us. You already came across to me as a very stubborn optimist, as the rest of our panel. What keeps you stubbornly optimistic? And please leave our audience with the optimism that we not only can, but must be the leaders that the world now needs.
Well, I wish my English would be better to translate my thought properly. But if we summarize it, we have a global issue. There is no global government. So it is up to each region, to each people, to each company to rise up to the challenge of the common good, while typically we would have our respective necks of the wood. I am optimistic because I saw what the world came through when it was time to prepare vaccines. We were scared and we got it right and we developed the vaccines. Well, I think we can develop this climate vaccine. It's going to be narrow, as Annie said. It's going to be challenging for the workforce, as James said. But as Basil said, it comes also to being able to tell the story, to sing the tune. It's not an easy tune to say. It's going to be difficult. But there is a beach at the end of this travel, a magnificent beach, to the extent that we can work together. And if I had to close with an image, it takes balls. And I'm sure we all have.
I could not have said that better. Thank you, Sophie, and all of you. I have to say the theme for the B team this year is that we have to become 10 times bolder. None of us are doing enough. And I'm so inspired by the common ground that I feel, even if we all come from multiple stakeholders' perspective here. So I want to thank the Climate Group for putting on a wonderful event and letting us conclude an important day here with this important conversation about why we have to put humanity at the heart of our transformational leadership and become 10 times bolder to get from here to shared prosperity on a healthy planet. We deserve it and we need it. But I also want to thank all of you who tuned in and ask you, what can I do? What are you doing? What could you be doing? Who are you going to choose to be at a moment like no other in history? We have to come out of that as transformational leaders. And I want to thank you for bringing your brilliance into this space and your humanity. So Sophie, Annie, Basil, and James, I am really grateful. And I really believe much stronger, as I always have, in a just and inclusive transition when I hear from people like you. I'd like to end with a little bit of an inspiration from the next generation. The wonderful poet Amanda Gorman put it so beautifully at a challenging time at the beginning of 2020 when she said, "For there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it." So let's get to work and let's do it together.
Thank you. Thank you, Hala, so much. And thanks for leading that fantastic panel and for bringing us that wrap up at the end and that question about optimism. And I think it's such a difficult year. And as Annie said, you know, there's been so much, but to find those shoots of optimism. So thank you so much for that panel. For our final session today, we're joined by Deborah Haaland, US Secretary for the Interior. She made history by becoming the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary. And while her role focuses primarily on the country's public lands, endangered species and natural resources, the department's also responsible for the government-to-government relations between the US and Native American tribes. She was one of the first co-sponsors of the Green New Deal and has a bold agenda for climate justice.
Hello, New York City. Thanks so much for having me during Climate Week. One of my largest priorities is to support the President's vision for a clean energy economy, so I'm grateful to join this session. I know that I don't have to tell anyone here that clean energy is one of the greatest economic opportunities that our country has at our disposal. The previous administration stalled our country's progress to move a clean energy economy, and it put our country in a very uncertain situation. The time to transition to a clean energy future could not be more urgent as we face the increased consequences of the climate crisis. We're seeing the impacts from climate change more intensely than ever before. Wildfire seasons that seem to never end, extreme hurricanes, severe drought, heat waves in places that have never had them before, and devastating weather events like the ones New York City experienced earlier this month. Storms are heavier and more frequent, sea levels are rising, and coastal flooding is becoming a part of everyday life. We are facing a climate crisis. It's a crisis that doesn't discriminate. Every community faces more extreme weather and the costs associated with the pain and heartache that those events bring. But not every community has the resources to rebuild or even relocate when a climate event happens in their backyards. The climate crisis disproportionately impacts communities of color and poor families. I come from a community that has borne the burden of mineral development. It's a legacy that impacts the health and well-being of our communities. It breaks my heart to hear about communities who have to leave their lands because of climate threats, or communities whose children are being poisoned by contamination in the air and water, or individuals struggling with homelessness, being left out in extreme heat or flooding, or rural farmers and ranchers who can no longer sustain themselves on their farms because the rain stopped coming. Every time I hear these stories, I think about the people I know and the people I've met along the way who were in those situations. I pray every day for relief for communities experiencing drought and flooding, but we all know that prayers are not enough. As our country faces the interlocking challenges of a global pandemic, an economic downturn, racial injustice, and the climate crisis, we have to transition to a brighter future for everyone. So yes, we have an opportunity to move ahead with clean energy. It's more than an opportunity, it's a necessity. The Biden-Harris administration not only recognizes the threats that climate change presents to every single community in the country, but also how clean energy jobs can help pull families out of poverty, protect our air and water, and make the United States an international leader in the fight against climate change. That's why President Biden hit the ground running and set ambitious goals that meet the urgent demands of the climate crisis. This will not only help communities who carry the burdens of climate injustice, but also empower American workers and businesses to lead a clean energy revolution. The Interior Department plays an important role in the President's plan to reinvest in the American people. We can deliver on the Build Back Better agenda while centering the voices of the and underrepresented. We can bolster climate resiliency and increase renewable energy and support tribal nations while advancing environmental justice. We are investing in communities and projects that will advance our vision for a robust and equitable clean energy future. Interior is identifying steps to increase responsible renewable energy development on our country's public lands and waters alike. Projects in offshore wind, solar, and geothermal can power our country, reduce emissions, and empower every single community. Imagine a world where families who have lost their livelihoods in coal country have new opportunities in clean energy, where people who are stuck in low-wage jobs can get into good-paying union jobs that will help them own a home, pay for college, and plan for the future, where parents don't have to worry about the water their children drink or the air they breathe. It's possible, and we have the leadership from the top down and from the grassroots up who are ready to do the work to make it happen. Here in New York, as part of the Biden-Harris administration's goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030, we're making major strides. Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is currently conducting an environmental review of a proposed commercial scale wind project to build up to 122 wind turbines. This could generate enough energy to power nearly 600,000 homes and would help New York meet its clean energy goal of achieving 70% of electricity from renewable sources by 2030. We have announced final wind energy areas in the shallow waters of the New York Bight, and we're engaged in robust discussions with diverse stakeholders to identify areas that may be appropriate for development. These projects and others like them onshore and offshore on public lands and waters across this country will have ripple effects throughout the economy. There will be jobs in manufacturing, technology development, energy production, maintenance, transmission construction, and so much more. And we're on the path to make sure those jobs are good-paying union jobs. Earlier this year, we announced the Vineyard Wind Project, the first large-scale offshore wind project in the United States, alongside labor leaders who work to ensure that the project is built and maintained by union labor. It's a game changer and a model we want to expand. Some might say a transition to a clean energy economy is complicated or difficult or cumbersome. And to them, my answer is, we know. But we're not afraid to do the hard things, especially when it's the right thing to do and especially when our future is on the line. It's how I was raised. I grew up in a Pueblo household, and my mother made sure we knew that our ancestors made tremendous sacrifices so that my siblings and I could succeed. Our ancestors lived sustainably and survived famine and drought with the understanding that future generations would rely on their hard work and sacrifice in challenging moments like these. The President recognizes our responsibility to future generations, and he shows that through his actions. It's not an either-or decision. We can address our climate crisis, build a sustainable economy, and address environmental injustice at the same time. We're committed to getting it done, and we need all of you to help us get there. Thank you so much for your commitment to learning about the work we're doing to move an equitable, clean energy economy forward, and for the work you're doing to get it done. Thank you for your work to center the voices of those who have not traditionally had a seat at the table. And most importantly, thank you for your faith in something bigger than yourself, in our ability to work together to create a brighter future for our children and our children's children. The work continues.
Thank you, Secretary Harland. An extremely important message for us all to take away from today's discussions. And that brings us to the end of this event. I want to thank all our speakers. Their message is very clear. We must put people at the heart of the energy transition if we are to realise its full potential. Secretary Granholm was clear that means everyone from across all sectors, even ones that might be currently fearful of the message of transition. And I hope everyone joining today has taken inspiration from our last panel to go out and be bold, optimistic leaders. Thank you for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Climate Week NYC, and do check out the rest of the week's schedule at www.climateweeknyc.org.